Hello and welcome to another episode of Builders, the podcast where we dive into the minds of those shaping the future of technology, innovation, and business. I'm Lee Haynes, and today I'm joined by a guest whose role is as futuristic as the ideas he works with, Ludvig Strand, emerging tech and AI future analyst at Axel Johnson. At the crossroads of corporate innovation and deep tech, Ludvig is helping one of Sweden's most prominent family-owned businesses explore the potential of AI, automation, and emerging technologies. His mission to map the trends that will shape the next generation of industries and help businesses prepare, adapt, and lead. We'll explore trend spotting, the future of generative AI, how enterprises can cut through the hype, and what it takes to stay future ready in a world of constant transformation. Ludvig, a warm welcome to the podcast. How's it going?
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. Really nice to have you here. I think let's dive straight in, but start with your journey. Can you share a bit about your background, how you found your way into the world of emerging tech and AI?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, I've always been a tech nerd by heart, but surprisingly not techie in my background. So it started with business education, but always been extra pumping when it comes to tech in general. And so I went straight from business school to rapid training in data science. This was 2019, and from there on I've been working within tech, but from the business side. So yeah, that's my way in, and of course started within the first wave of AI, which was all about machine learning, taking large amounts of data that we have in our consumer facing businesses, and making sense of that. And also from there on, about 2020, I started reading about this new GPT-3 from an OpenAI lab that got me really, really interested in generative AI, and on that path it is. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And your title, I mentioned it before, Emerging Tech and AI Future Analyst. I mean, this isn't one that we come across every day. It's quite niche. What does that entail? What does that actually look like in your day-to-day work at Axel Johnson?
Yeah, good question. I get that all the time. I usually use this quote that we live in a world of hyperactivity and hypersignificance, meaning that things are happening all the time, as you all know, and it feels like all these developments every week is the most important yet. And essentially, what I try to do in this group of 300 businesses is to help our companies to really sort this out. Of course, they have great teams of builders and great teams of visionaries and business developers that knows quite a lot about what they're doing, but of course they often spend time on building and spend time on these projects that can take 6 months, a year, and so on. It's difficult to keep up with everything that's happening all the time, and so that's what I try to do, to really follow the research, follow the latest developments, and try to extrapolate and see, well, what is this going to mean for us in 3 to 5 years, and so on. So yeah.
It sounds awesome, I must say. So Axel Johnson's a diverse group of companies, right? You mentioned 300
yes.
There. How do you tailor your tech and AI insights to such a broad portfolio of industries? Is it more focused on certain companies in that group, or is it kind of for all of them?
Yeah. So it's very broad. We're both in. I'd say that our largest part is within foods, and of course a lot of focus goes towards the food sector. Is also one of the few consumer-facing sectors that we have right now, and that's of course where we see developments happening quicker. But then, of course, we have everything from health to distributed energy to industrial systems and so on. And we cater to all of these and try to see what are the general transformative concepts here that applies to all. But then, of course, try to adjust our topics to the different types of companies. But it's very fun to have this diverse portfolio as well. So you see the bigger picture of and can connect the dots between very different companies and to see the larger trend there. Yeah.
Yeah, I can imagine. Like diverse group of companies makes for diverse work days as well, right? But to talk a little bit about trend spotting, obviously, like the future doesn't arrive all at once, right? It's about spotting these signals early on. How do you approach identifying emerging trends? What methods or frameworks, if any, help you separate like real trends or real innovation from these, like, passing noise? Because there's a lot of noise out there, right?
Yeah. And it's very difficult, of course. A lot of noise, a lot of hype, and so I think the equation comes down to supply and demand. So what is the supply? What is the technology underneath the trend? And then also the demand side. How quick do you think people will move on this? So I think most importantly, it comes down to, instead of following trends, to really deep dive into the technology and understanding the technology. And this is also what I will say to business leaders and try to recommend to them, instead of just following the headlines, to understand what is really underneath here. So take agents, for instance, the most hype word of this year. Of course, they're built on LLMs today. LLMs are not made to perform action. They're made to predict the next sequence of language, and so they're not the perfect tool for agents. And so a much hyped word. And if we look underneath and at the technology, we see that, well, there's a lot of flaws here that doesn't make up for good agents. So it's quite limited in what we see today. Of course, we have AI workflows, much more determined, but it doesn't meet up to this self-guided type of agent that we envision. And so it's very difficult to keep track of this, because the suppliers are selling agents and everyone is talking about their AI bots as agents, but it's really not. But on the other hand as well, to see, okay, so what breakthroughs do we need then in order to supply for these agents, which is a very strong concept and really, I think, a vision that is very appealing for companies and future of consumer markets and so on. And we can look at steps towards that. We have these reasoning models now, which is trained in another way than large language models, with reinforcement learning, trained just to perform actions and so on. Very good first mainstream agentic tools like deep research, where we see, well, this is really getting better on these agentic things. We have things like standardized protocols like MCP from Anthropic, which is really about standardizing these models and the tools they use. So instead of customizing instructions and prompts and so on for each tool use, we can have this standardized layer, so we just can connect the apps and tools to these agents. And so we see, of course, a lot of progress in that direction, but it's not there yet. So yeah, long answer to your question, but yeah.
No, but it's a very good answer. And I think a lot of us are kind of, those keeping up with the trends are kind of hearing the agentic AI kind of buzzword time and time again. But in addition to agents, agentic AI and everything, what are some of the most exciting or maybe surprising trends that you're currently tracking within AI and emerging tech?
Yeah. So I mentioned a few. MCP is a great one to look out for. Even for the Gen AI tools we build today, an agent workflows that is not even agentic, but MCP is a really good protocol to look at, and it is gaining a lot of traction at the moment in the developer community. I mentioned reinforcement learning, and so for these reasoner models, they are of course built on large language models, but then they are post-trained with reinforcement learning techniques, and this is really interesting if you look at the trajectory of AI models, because if we divide the type of learning into two buckets, we have one part is imitation learning, and that's virtually all AI apps we use today, all things being developed by our data scientists, even to the large language models that we use. They're used or trained on historical data from humans, and it's very good. Often they average above the standard human, you can say, in various different fields, and so that's awesome. But it's also a kind of cap where we have the best data available is the best human performant people, and it's hard to surpass that. But the other type of learning, which is reinforcement learning, can really explore strategies beyond what we as humans can come up with. So we've had this great examples from Google DeepMind during the first part during the 2010s with AlphaGo, for instance, which is reinforcement learning learning strategies that hundreds of years of human Go players haven't come up with yet, and can beat all humans in that. We see that in AlphaFold, for instance, which earned the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last year. But it's been very limited to domains where we can verify the results. We need a way of the computers to self-verify in order to simulate this, and that's very hard for language domains and open-ended domains that we use LLMs for today. But very clever developments from DeepSeek and OpenAI and so on, enabling computers to now again self-verify its result on logic domains, but then also generalize these learnings. This when it learns to reason about how to break down steps and self-critique and move back and iterate and so on, can then be applied on more open-ended domains. And so it's quite interesting now when we have a way of putting reinforcement learning in the training and to see where it can lead. Today, the reasoning models perform above PhD experts on average in their own domains. So it's quite a leap from the typical LLMs that we had just 6 months ago. So that's quite interesting as well.
No, it's really, I agree. Super interesting to see how it's like you were saying about the imitation learning versus like the reinforcement learning, and how maybe one has that cap where it's like you're only going to be as good as the best humans, whereas the next step is obviously, okay, how do we go beyond?
And
see how that's opening up.
Yeah. Just to add to that as well. So what does it mean for us as companies then when we have these types of capabilities? What does it mean for us as companies? Every employee can have this PhD level knowledge across domains. Of course, do we need PhDs for every kind of task? Probably not. But on the other hand, we also probably haven't used PhD level knowledge on tasks because it's just been infeasible, too expensive. And so what does it mean now when we can unlock this? Just a typical employee can have access to really PhD level sustainability solutions to build into their product developments and so on. So it's really something that really should prompt us as organizations and as builders to reassess what AI really can do as opposed to 1 year ago.
It's just far vaster abilities or capabilities, right? Opportunities for the companies. But it's also, I was reading how, I think it was Gartner that's like predicting over 50% of enterprise AI projects failing due to like unclear objectives. So like an unclear understanding as to what it is companies might want the AI to do, or understanding how it's going to do it. So like future analysts like yourself I would imagine play a really crucial role in, I guess, asking the right questions before jumping to solutions, right? So how do you advise the different companies you're working with in the group to like critically evaluate the AI solutions before they're adopted, essentially?
I think this is, when I look at both, of course, we have a lot of companies and a lot of examples, but also outside the group and in general, when it comes to how companies approach AI today, and when it doesn't deliver on the visions and what we talk about, what it can do, and so on. And I had a quite interesting story, if I can tell, from last summer. So me and my family were in Finland. We have relatives living there, and my dad grew up on summers there, and so he told a story from his grandfather, which was a farmer, and he told me when his grandfather first purchased his first tractor, and so of course for farming a revolutionary technology, but the thing was that it was quite an expensive investment. So in order to do that investment, he had to use his old horse cart and attach it to the tractor instead of buying the new carts that are adjusted for the new tractors. So he brought his old horse cart, attached it to the tractor, and sat upon that behind the tractor. And of course, it wasn't self-guided as the horse was, so they needed a driver to drive the tractor. So in this case, they increased from being one person doing the job to now being two people. So this extremely transformative technology that should, revolutionize farming now required two people instead of one. And why is that? Well, it's because they took this new technology and they put it into a context which was horse adjusted or adjusted for horses, and it gave me just this good analogy to where we as businesses usually are today, or where we are today. We usually take this new revolutionizing technology such as generative AI with great new capabilities that we haven't had before, and then we try to put it into our old structures, our old ways of doing things, and we don't really see the effect there. And I think the real value from generative AI will come not only when we put it into workflows where it makes sense, like marketing and sales and so on, but where we really try to rethink our operative models, our way of doing things based on these new capabilities. And so yeah, that's one thing, and what I try to help our companies with, to really see, okay, what are these capabilities really enabling, and how can we rethink what we do based on it, and not only to try to fit it into current structures.
No, really, really good point. So, I mean, obviously AI is transforming how businesses operate, moving the goalposts, so to speak. But like we said, not all companies are kind of ready for that shift. They don't have everything set up in order to kind of really benefit from it. But how does Axel Johnson and how do you in your work kind of think about AI as part of its kind of broader innovation strategy?
Yeah. So we're a 150-year-old company, so it's fun to talk about innovation and new technology with a company which has such a legacy. But of course, anyone who's survived for 150 years and thriving knows that long-term strategy comes down to renewal, to always keep renewing yourself. So we have it, in the DNA to always try to renew ourselves. We have this 10-50 goal, which we just completed. So, the last 10 years, or 50% of what we're doing today is new compared to 10 years ago. And so we have this goal for next 10 years that, 50% of what we're doing in 10 years should be new things. So it's really in that type of DNA. And of course, new technology and AI is an increasing part of that as well. And so since 2017, we have deployed more than 100 machine learning or 150 machine learning models that's running every day towards 1.5 million customers and so on. We have invested over 4 billion in automating warehouses. We built the first generative shopping experience in Sweden together with Kicks, and that was a really fun project where I usually sit with more strategic questions and conceptual questions to actually go down to one of our companies at that time and build this first LLM.
Which project was that?
So that's at Kicks, the beauty chain. We don't own Kicks anymore, but we the minute that ChatGPT launched and we tried it for different cases, one of the first cases was semantic search. We had tried for a couple of years to think about how do we solve semantic search. Go from keyword-based search where we have to manually type in errors and so on in order to capture what the user actually wants, to move to something more semantic where we can just understand the intent, even though he uses words that's different than our product information system. And it was quite difficult at that time, 2022, to solve. When we talked with some of the biggest retailers in the world, and they said, well, this is something we try to achieve, but it's just too difficult at this moment. And then ChatGPT came out, and instantly it could surpass all e-commerce search that I've seen. And so when the APIs were released in April, this was the first case that we tried. So together with Kicks, we built this generative search that could understand intent. So I could say that, well, I'm going to the Alps for a couple of weeks to hike. What should I need? And so ChatGPT could then, and this was 3.5, understand the context of a beauty chain and translate whatever fussy thing I said. That, well, if you're going to the Alps, you should probably need sun lotion because it's quite strong sun in the Alps, and you need hydration or lotion, to dehydrate the skin and so on. So quite fascinating. So that was the first Gen AI experiment we built, and it was launched as the first generative shopping experience in Sweden. So it was exciting. Yeah.
Super, super nice. Yeah, and still on the topic of companies not being ready for the shift, as I was saying before, and with so much happening in generative AI, from text to image to code as well. How should enterprises be thinking about where to start, where to go, basically?
Yeah, it's a large question.
Yeah, it's a huge question. Yeah, it's a generalization as well, but
Yeah, I think one way of looking at it is I usually think about the difference between having a buy-in, as most companies are doing today. Three quarters, I think McKinsey says, of companies have built Gen AI things today. And at Axel Johnson, we have over 50 different Gen AI experiments and so on. And that's quite easy to say. And it's quite easy to have this buy-in in the technology. What's more difficult is to have this core belief in the technology and in the transformational part in it. And I think it's just a good analogy when, if you look at electricity, for instance. So when electricity came, it took, 30 years for the automobile industry to really be transformed by the technology, because a lot of car manufacturers had this buy-in and said, well, we will use electricity, we will have lightning in our factories, we can work 3 shifts or whatnot. So very good and very valuable technology. But it was only until Henry Ford came in and said, well, buy-in is not enough, and really believed in the transformative aspects of the technology. Again, looking at the capabilities, the underlying capabilities, and how we can change the operative model based on that. And so that's when they shifted the whole car production thing, and the rest was history. So I think getting to a point, and that's what I try every day to do with our companies, to help them to see the real transformative aspects and what's substance today, as opposed to the hype and as opposed to the headlines and the buy-in that most people have. And so that's a start. Then of course we can talk about more practically how organizations should organize to this, and yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of studies out there, obviously, talking about how Gen AI is going to add trillions of dollars to the global economy annually. But a lot of them talk about only if enterprises kind of move from experimentation to kind of implementation, strategic implementation. Are there any practical steps that you recommend to enterprises and companies to kind of move from, let's say, pilots to meaningful AI adoption?
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting with this technology, with generative AI, because it's so easy to start, so easy for companies to build demos in hours instead of 8 weeks with experts that you need to hire in and so on. So it's so paradoxical, because it's so easy to start, it's so easy to get the first kind of pilots going, but it's quite difficult rather to scale these up, and of course, as a new technology, it's so different from the previous ways that we've related to computers and to technology, really, because most of the things that we use today and most of the things that our companies run are very deterministic. You ask it one thing and it will deliver the same answer each time, and so on. And now all of a sudden we have something probabilistic that we really don't know how to steer well. And there's new types of questions coming to that. And from a developer point of view, it can be a hassle to build Gen AI apps, and especially if you want to scale them. So yeah, that's a real challenge. And I think the only way is just to it's new for everyone. So just testing yourself or get going, just building, trying is the way to get there. And of course, one recommendation we usually have to companies not to start with too much. Try to be focused with a couple of high priority cases and build them well, and then continue from there. Otherwise, you will spread yourself too thin, and you won't see the real impact. So, yeah.
Yeah. Any real world examples at Axel Johnson where Gen AI is already kind of making a tangible impact? Any good examples you can share?
Yeah. We have lots of examples. Most of them are just the typical kind of examples within marketing and within, this first type of areas. But one of the most interesting examples we have is from our company called Dustin. It's a IT products provider. And it was actually one thing that they really nailed is to get the interest across the board. And there are different ways of organizing to do this and get AI on top agenda and so on. But so they actually got the question from the legal team. It was not them trying to push anything, but the legal team came to their team saying that, well, we spend a lot of hours on this particular task when it comes to analyzing tenders or tender offerings. So they get requests from big customers to buy lots of things, and they will then provide tenders for this. And so they need a big legal team to analyze and see, well, what's a fit? How does it meet up to our requirements? How does this meet up to certain things? And there's a lot of hours every week going into this. And now they instead use, you could say it's not AI agents, because they're not self-directed, but it's AI workflows rather. But say 4 different AI bots working together to solve these different things. So one bot is taking whatever request is coming in and analyzing that. Another one is matching to their own, requirements and so on, and have a really amazing flow that takes away most of the part of this work every week. So I can't share too much, but it's just a fascinating way of doing it.
Nice.
We have another company called One Lab. They are a health provider, or not provider, but they do health checks for companies or employees in companies. So people in these companies do digital health checks and so on. They get a lot of metrics, and they have nurses looking at these metrics and trying to make sense of them, and then circling back to the employee to talk about their health. And the nurses, they put so much time in just trying to make sense of the data and contextualizing that. And so instead, we have LLMs that perform extremely well on medical data and can easily contextualize this for us. And so they built a very nice flow as well to automate large, I wouldn't say, it could be 80-90% of this flow, really, of contextualizing it. And so the nurses can then spend more time with the clients, with the employees, and put more effort on seeing, the bigger picture and so on, instead of rather just doing the details. And so that's a very nice flow. And I'll share one external as well, which I think is very, very good example. Is last year I met with developers who built this supply negotiation chatbot for Walmart. And so Walmart have a really good team of negotiators negotiating with the big clients for prices and all of that. But they have over 100,000 suppliers and a very, very long tail. And what I think is interesting with this case is that they didn't build a negotiator for their own negotiators. It's not a co-pilot helping them negotiate. Maybe they have that too. But what they built was something for the rest of the suppliers that didn't have or get the possibility to really negotiate with Walmart. And so they could automate that process. And that's hugely valuable for Walmart. There's tons of money on the table, but they don't have resources or time to negotiate with every single of these. So they shared a lot of that is really, really proving value for Walmart. Is one of the best cases Walmart has at the moment. Yeah.
They're really, really cool examples. But what are some of the most common misconceptions or blind spots you see when companies are kind of first exploring generative AI in your experience?
Yeah, good question. I think the last 2 years, it's really been hallucinations and this probabilistic nature of Gen AI bots. It's so difficult for some people to understand that this is something else than our deterministic functions. We shouldn't use LLMs for things where we should have exact answers in a specific in the same format every time. Of course, we can use tools to LLMs, and yeah, there's a lot of things we could do with getting correct answers. But where it's very critical to get correct answers, we shouldn't use chatbots for it. And so that's the first 2 years. And now there's this big misconception about agents, of course, what it is and what it's not, and there's so many suppliers selling agents that are not really self-guided, and there's just a confusion around that term. And the last thing I'd say is regarding, I don't know if you should call it onboarding, but when we take in human intelligence, when we take in people to our organizations, of course we know that they have a general capability. They're very often general purpose, in such that they have a plateau, a foundational education in knowing things and how things work, but they are not specialized in your company culture and how you function and so on. This is something that they learn while on the job, and something we onboard them to. But we have often different expectations on LLMs and on generative AI tools, that they should know all this already. And so we try to use them as we use our employees, and then we see that they fall short. But of course, we haven't given them the context. We haven't given them enough experience from our organization. And of course, so this is a huge area where we will need to see, we will need to do more sophisticated going forward. How do we onboard new LLMs to make them more effective in our spaces?
Yeah. And to talk a little bit about AI's impact, like moving forward, or kind of trying to, where one can kind of forecast AI's impact. I think we can kind of quite often overestimate what technology can do in 1 year, for example, but underestimate what it can do in, say, 5 or 10 further down the line. Not that I like to look too far ahead nowadays, but how do you anticipate AI changing the structure of organizations or industries?
Yeah, I think what you quoted, Amara's law, is so valid still. That we overestimate the impact in short term and underestimate it in the long term, and that's it's really true. And this is something that you need to balance out when you look at the trajectories. And so how do we have a more sober approach or sober view of the impact today? Well, it comes down to what I've mentioned before, that we really should know the technology. That's the way of sobering up. So what's the limitations and so on.
The flaws, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. But at the same time, we also need to not dismiss the more transformative potential in the long term. Of course, as you say, I've also given up this 10 years trying to forecast where things are heading, because it's just impossible. But usually I with this thinking and the story I talked about with where companies are today versus how we will transform companies in the future, looking at the operative models and so on, I usually divide it into 2 waves, at least to begin with. That we are in this first wave, where we are taking the existing technology, trying to put it into existing processes. But I think in 2, 3, or 5 years, we will start to see much more of this second wave, this wave where we really look at the capabilities and redefine how a company functions and redefine operative models and customer experiences and so on. And so that's very exciting. And I think at least on a 5-year time horizon, we will start to see these AI native companies really starting to disrupt industries. We see it already in, say, software development. It's often the first space to be disrupted, with companies like Cursor and Lovable with 10 to 15 people already making 10 to 100 million dollars just after a few months. So what will happen when we have companies in more traditional industries that rely on much fewer people, that can have much larger impact per employee, just because they have this AI and agentic native type of organizations that will really start to disrupt and move things. And if we think that as I often believe that technology goes before societal change, and that societal change often take longer time than we think. Well, when we start to see AI native companies and these very, very efficient types of companies, they will change the cost of things, and the cost is a really, really good driver of change. So if something should change society, then it's cost of things, and that's really when we're gonna see disruption, I think.
And if you had to make one bold prediction about AI's impact on business, what would it be, if any?
One bold vision for companies, I think. Multi-agent systems is something very thrilling to think about. Of course, it comes down to foundational parts of the technology that needs to be solved and needs to be matured much longer than it is today. But really, we have a company in our group that started to think about this last year. They built another company building a AI workflow in one function, and they said that, well, in 1 or 2 years, we could have these type of flows in all across our organizations to have it in not only sales but in marketing, in finance, in legal side, and so on. And they imagine that, well, in 3 or 4 years, what happens if we can start to connect these? If these agents, which is it will be at that point, if they can start to talk with each other in real time across silos, with no lag, with no hierarchy to follow, but really it can solve things on the spot 24/7. What will that type of organization look like? So if I should have one really provocative bet, that would be it. Yeah,
really, really, really well put. But there's a lot of what we're talking about here is obviously opportunity, right? But the future also brings new risks, right? What are the biggest ethical concerns you're thinking about when it comes to AI adoption at scale?
Yeah, and it's very important for companies to think about these things because it's at the end it's affecting people. And to get to the point, well, if we think about bias, for instance, it's not something that's been solved yet. AI systems are in their nature biased because it's trained on human data, and in this case, for LLMs, for instance, it's trained on a very Western, predominantly white internet, and there's certain values that goes into the base training there. Of course, they spend a lot of time in trying to align the models and try to balance it out. Sometimes too much, and sometimes not enough. Most of the time, not enough. But either way, it's more like putting lipstick on a pig. The fundamental problem is still there, and it's still affecting people, and often minority groups and so on. And we have talking about facial recognition is not something we use extensively in Sweden, even though we have used it in the Swedish police force before. But facial recognition is, for instance, has a 100 times higher error rate for certain, if you're not a white male, and that gets quite problematic. And there are other areas as well. So how do we deal with this, with these ethical concerns? Well, of course, most of the explicit bias is not there anymore, but the more implicit things we need to be aware of, and it comes down to, well, AI basically is a human-centered technology. It's all about humans. We are the ones steering the technology. We are training data. We're steering the technology. We're the ones using the technology, and so I think the work we can do there as users of the technology is really to improve our own awareness of how these tools function, what the problems are, and how we can use them, because they can also be used as tools to minimize our own biases. So, for instance, take one of the most well-known cases in bias, which is Amazon, which used AI models in their recruitment process. This was a prototype and not live, but the result of that was that it still discriminated women on these applications, just because of not only their names, but when they blinded that, it was also how they describe themselves in the text and so on, because that differs from how men stereotypically describe themselves. And so, of course, then we can say that, well, this AI is very problematic. But if you flip it, it's quite helpful, because this AI is actually exposing our own structural biases. It's actually our own training data and our own ways of recruiting that is problematic in its core. And so we can use AI also to detect our own biases. And Johnson & Johnson is another company who's been using LLMs, for instance, to detect where their job posting or job descriptions are leaning towards this male kind of biased language to more natural natural language, and they increased female applicants by 9%. So these are also good cases. So we can really use this technology. It comes down to being aware and being intentful in how we use the technology. Yeah, long story for that question. But.
No, it's good. And I was going to have a follow-up question where to talk about kind of operationalizing ethical AI, like going beyond these statements and guidelines, but these are very, very good examples. But in addition to this as well, I mean, there's regulation, right? Far more of it in Europe or in the EU than in the States, for example. But I mean, regulation's evolving. Some might say fast, some others might say slowly, certainly slower than the technology itself, right? Which is problematic for some. But how do you see AI policy and governance shaping the future of like enterprise innovation?
Yeah, I think this is I think people make this a bigger problem than it is. Of course, we have a lot of new regulations coming in Europe. Not all of them are perfect in any way. But most of the things that we do with AI, that we build with AI as normal companies, are not high risk in any sense. They're considered low risk, and so this is not something that the EU AI Act, for instance, should stop in any way. So we don't have to put too much resources on that part, because it's just not riskful. And wherever the EU AI Act is addressing for these high risk cases, well, it's because they are high risk, and because there's potentially people getting affected of these models or from these models. And so, of course, there we should have these regulations. Why shouldn't we? As I think there's just too much talk about AI regulations stopping our innovation. But when I talk with developers about what they're developing, none of this is high risk, and so it's not really concrete what is actually stopping. What apps are we trying to build that we can't build because of the EU regulations? There's not so many of them, and so I think that the arguments against EU or regulations are more conceptual. It's more conceptual and principled. I'd say that more regulation hampers innovation. But there's not too much substance under that, at least from what I've seen yet. Yeah,
it's an interesting point, because I think there's this assumption, right, where companies feel, with the introduction of certain acts, that they feel they maybe need to reevaluate not just what they build, but how they're building it, right? So it's more navigating compliance, becoming part of this like innovation strategy. So it's super interesting to hear that those you're talking to don't see it kind of panning out that way in reality, in practice so much.
Yeah. And if we talk about why regulation needs to be in place, well, the case is quite clear that the AI is a technology unlike anything we've seen before. It's affecting people in ways that we haven't seen before. If we think social media has been affecting people and how we relate to each other and our society, I think AI is 100 times that, if not more. We already see in research that AI is 80% more prone to change your mind on opinions than people are. Not prone to, but actually they're 80% more effective in changing your mind than other people are. And we see these AI companion types of bot that really, if you don't use it, you don't think that it's such a big application space, but it's huge. There's millions of people using AI for companion uses, like a friend or a spouse or something like it. And
Therapist. Yeah.
therapists and so on, and people are getting really hooked on this, and that scares me a bit. So I think we definitely need these regulations in place.
Yeah. Regulations can't all be bad, right? Yeah. But let's wrap up with some perspective, particularly for any decision makers that might be listening in. What advice would you give to business leaders who are trying to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to AI and emerging tech?
Yeah, good question. I think we've mentioned some other things. One being, moving from this type of buy-in to really getting to know the technology in depth. You don't need to know the maths behind it, but knowing what the technology actually is built to do and what it solves and what limitations are and so on. And then getting hands-on with the technology to always try out the new models, try out new reasoning capabilities, deep research, and so on. I think that's, getting hands-on. 30 minutes with deep research will be a better lecture for you than hours of presentations about where things are headed this year. And so, getting hands-on with it is my best advice.
Good advice. What mindset or approach do you think is most valuable in the time we're living in right now? Is considerable acceleration, uncertainty as well. So what mindset or approach do you think is most valuable?
Yeah, big question. The greatest question, maybe. I think curiosity is first and foremost, because we can't dismiss all of things that are happening, and sometimes it can feel like a flood wave if you don't work day to day with AI questions, and be quite difficult to get or wrap your head around. But be curious and also stay critical minded, because the future with AI is going to be messy, I think, and we need to keep our heads straight. Those are the things.
Yeah, really, really well put. But before I wrap up here, is there anything you'd like to add?
Good question. I haven't thought about anything to add to this. Just lovely to have this conversation, and anyone listening, feel free to reach out at any point. I'll be happy to chat.
Well, super. And thank you so much for joining, sharing your insights into, navigating the fast moving world of AI, staying curious in the face of change. So really, really appreciate you joining us today, Ludvig.
It was fun to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you. And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Builders, leave a review, share it with someone else who might be curious about the future as well. Until next time, keep innovating, keep learning, and keep on building. We'll see you soon.